공산국가에 왜 신분제다가 제도가
You might wonder why a caste system would exist in a communist state.
저는 그 북한에서
I was educated in North Korea, and this is how I was taught about the communist system.
공산주의 제도라는 거는
The communist system aims for a world without classes, thus becoming the ideal society.
실제로 북한은 이런 세상을 만들기 위해서
North Korea attempted to create a utopian regime, and the first thing they did was to purge the landlords and the capitalists. Their goal was to eliminate the ruling class and create an equal society.
그래서 김일성 정권 초기에 죽여야 될 사람과 숙청해야 될 사람
Therefore, in the early reign of Kim Il-sung, people were categorized into those to be purged and those who were his allies.
사람들을 가르는 기준이 있었는데 그 기준이 뭐냐?
The division depended on whether they owned property.
그러면 재산이 어느 정도 있을 때 이게
Owning a single cow was used as a benchmark for getting purged.
그래서 집안에 소 한 마리 붙어 있으면 이거는
If someone had a cow in their house, they were considered wealthy. They were either killed or purged, sent to labor camps.
또 어떤 지역에서는 심지어 이 기준이 애매한 경우도
In some regions, the standards for purging seemed ambiguous.
속에서도 잘 사는
Everyone was poor after the Japanese colonization. Some were less poor, and others were destitute.
손바닥 만져.
So deciding how to be purged was hard. So in some places, the regime checked for people's soft palms. It meant that the person hadn't done much labor in the past. These people were promptly executed. It was a time of great tragedy. If you had more than one cow, your properties were confiscated. And the parents of these households were executed. Their kids were spared, however.
그 다음에 북한 정권은 누구를 이렇게 품었냐면요.
Then North Korea allowed the extremely poor, the slaves, the laborers, and the landless to live.
예, 도시에서는 일용직 노동자들, 재산이 전혀 없는 사람들은
These people were selected to be leaders of the regime.
그런 사람들을 가지고 국가를 만들어요.
With such people, they built a nation, and as a result, you saw people rising to national leadership just because their father had been, a serf or a labor.
군 도지사가 막 되고 군을 지도하는
And they suddenly became governors or political leaders.
그 무일푼 노동자였다는 이유로
The penniless suddenly became the head of the construction department.
그래서 이것이 북한에서 한때는 선전하는 영화로
This became the subject of a propaganda film, and I remember watching it as a child.
이렇게 해서 정말
This is how they created a world where the truly poor became high-class rulers.
왜 이렇게 했느냐?
They did this because they held a belief that was like truth to them. The notion was that the rich people were evil and poor people were good. And they believed that this world would become a utopia if the poor became masters and leaders of their new government.
지금 생각해 보면 좀 말도 안 되는 야만의 시.
When I think about the history of North Korea's establishment, I realize how unimaginably, absolutely barbaric it was.
그 모습질이나 하던 사람들이 군당.
Imagine slaves and servants who, never received proper education, becoming national leaders and factory bosses. Could a country operate normally with such directors? They might have unyielding loyalty. However, running a country and managing a factory is different than working in the fields. It requires tremendous experience, knowledge, and know-hows, so you must be educated. Yet the educated people were mostly from wealthy families. The poor had no means to be educated. If all the wealthy and educated were executed by the North Korean regime, no qualified people to run the country would be left.
그래서 북한이
So North Korea changed its policy. They decided to spare the intellectuals. And how else, would they run the country? So they spared those who converted to their side, and they absorbed these intellectuals into the regime as a part of the new government.
만드는 한 일원으로 인정을 해요.
For these reasons, North Korea's Workers' Party of Korea created its emblem and a national flag with a sickle and hammer, and a writing brush. However, the Russian symbol only contained the sickle and the hammer.
거의 러시아에서는 지식인들도 인정을 안 해요.
The Russians had not acknowledged the intellectuals, but North Korea dealt with the situation more flexibly by recognizing three types of people needed in the regime.
목표는
And although their initial goal was to create a classless society, they settled on a society of three classes, workers, peasants, and intellectuals. Thus, they started a socialist society, calling it a communist transitional period. Their ultimate goal was to advance socialism and eventually eliminate these three classes. They would lead them to the ideal communist society. Thus, in North Korea, all classes except for these three disappeared, and they began moving towards a classless society.
그러면 우리 이렇게 생각해 봅시다. 계급이 없어진
Let us think about this. What kind of a world would we see in a classless society? Those who never lived in such a world are curious. And it seems nice, doesn't it?
좋을 것 같아요.
Just the thought of everyone being equal seems appealing. Their goal was to create an equal society. Imagine a world where everyone is equal. How nice. I have lived in a world without classes. And living in such a world showed me that the human imagination and reality are different. This great idea strictly divided the people into the ruling and the ruled classes. You either ruled over others or you were ruled by the rulers.
북한은 지도자들이 있어야 되잖아요. 근데 그 지도하는 사람들이 대부분
North Korea needed leaders. But their new leaders were mostly day-to-day laborers and poor peasants who never got a proper education.
세련된 지도력을 기대할 수 있을까요?
Can we expect sophisticated leadership from them? Would they possess an ideal governing capability that sees all circumstances and makes things fair?
그게 불가능해진 거예요.
That became impossible. The intelligent were turned into slaves, while the uneducated became the ruling class. So in North Korea, the rulers and the ruled were clearly divided. It didn't matter if you were smart or intelligent.
신분, 아버지가 옛날 모습이
If one's father were a servant, the son would take part in the ruling class eternally. It didn't matter what his character or ability was like. Does this society sound appealing?
그러니까 이게 어느 정도 차이를 가져왔냐면 북한은
North Korea employs forced mobilization from middle schools to universities. As a university student, just because they provided free education, I was forced to work 2 months in the countryside in the spring and another month in the fall. And it was truly a horrific time of forced labor. The intensity was mind-boggling.
그래서 제가 농촌에 가서 일을 하는데
When I went to the countryside to work, I went with my 30 classmates. We had a class leader to teach us. We also had a chairman in charge of political community party issues. So out of the 30, 2 were in leadership. And these 2 gave orders, and while we worked our bones off all day, the 2 leaders played all day.
작업 지시만 하고 오늘은 이 땅에서 여기서부터 여기까지
They would order us around telling us to plant rice or to weed the fields. We were complete slaves. We worked hard under the scorching sun. But the leaders would take naps in the shade or take walks when bored. At the time, we thought, this was how it was supposed to be.
아, 원래 세상이 이런가 보다. 지금 생각은 아니.
That was how, our world operated. It makes me angry to think about it even now. When it came to food, the leaders would receive better and more food while we were always left hungry. And after graduating and being sent to the Chongjin steel plant, the situation was the same.
한 작업반에 이렇게 전기반에
I was assigned to an electrician's crew, typically numbering between 30 and 50 people.
되는데 거기도 반장이 있고
There too was a team leader and a political chairman. These two would just enjoy themselves, get paid more, and get credit for all things done well, while all we could do was work our fingers to the bone.
그들이 능력이 있냐?
But did they have any skills? No, they were simply chosen to be our rulers to give order.
진짜 능력 있는 사람은 우리죠.
Because we learned our skills at university, the truly capable people were us. But we were just slaves with skills. Does this seem right to you? When such a clear division of two classes occurred, a problem arose. Those once slaves became masters. Was this a good thing from an ex-servant's perspective? Absolutely. The North Korean proverb says, a servant who becomes a landlord is even more vicious. Now that these servants became landlords, they enjoyed it immensely.
그러니까 이 제도를 다시 다른 사람에게 자기가 누리고 있던 이 지배
Would they want to give up this dominant privilege? Far from it.
그러니까 이 사람들은 무계급 사회다 하고 이렇게 이론은 그렇게 만들어 놨는데 그다음에 자기들이 이
These people embarked on a mission to ensure their position forever.
그러려면 구실이 있어야 되잖아요. 옛날에는 인간 사회가 어떤
In the past, human societies were divided by standards such as ability, wealth, or power. But they couldn't divide a society like that because their goal was to live in equality. So they began to split the classes based on the loyalty shown to the Kim Il-sung family and how much loyalty they could show in the future. Thus, North Korea created new classes, the core, the wavering, and the hostile.
핵심 계층이 누구냐?
And who were the core class?
김일성이 옛날에
Those who fought alongside Kim against the Japanese and the Kim family members. The three classes were further divided into 51 subclasses. North Korea's goal was to create a classless society, but it created more intricate and impenetrable permanent caste system.
그래서 제일 상위 레벨에는 누가 있느냐?
Who was in the highest class? Kim Il-sung and his family, the royals. If you were married to Kim's, most distant relative, you'd still be at the top of the core class. The privileges they enjoyed were akin to extraterritorial rights. It meant that these people could commit murder and not be subject to the law's judgment. And why? Because they were above the law.
이거는 완전히 다른 세상이죠.
And this was a completely different world. And this core class took all the privileges of North Korean society, education, rationing, foreign travel. All these privileges were concentrated among them.
공부 못하니? 그럼 정치학교 보내면 돼.
And if their children were slow academically, they could be sent to a political schools. After graduating, they'd become, party secretaries, forever securing the family's position. North Korea's Kim dynasty is often criticized for its three-generation succession. And why should the royal family abstain when the whole country is doing
네,
this?
그렇게 돼요. 그리고
Now let's look at the wavering class. It would be impossible for the children of the executed intellectuals to be sympathetic to the regime. And there were these foreigners from Japan or China. These people were considered to be the wavering class. They were not enemies, yet couldn't be on your side as well. I belonged to the wavering class, for my parents had immigrated to North Korea from China. And lastly, who was the hostile class? The religious people. Those who were Christians or Buddhists in the past and had no reason to be loyal to Kim Il-sung. They had their own deities. Then there were the people who sided with the South Korean army while under siege during the Korean War. Their children became hostile class. The lowest class of slaves in North Korean society was this hostile class.
일반 계층이 딱이 맞을 죄.
If the hostile class commits an offense that would normally just earn a slap for the other classes, they must go to prison. And if they commit a more serious offense, they are taken to political prison camps. And because of them, the North Korean society appears to have a guilt by association system. Actually, there are no such laws in North Korea. No law says if parents commit a crime, their children are to be taken away. But that is what happens. When the parents commit a crime, the children are taken away.
이렇게 북한에는
North Korea proposed to create a classless society, but ironically ended up creating a permanently fixed multitude of classes.
그래서 인도에 가면 영구적인
I've heard that, there in India has a hereditary caste system. North Korea is no different. No one can break this system. North Korea started with the goal of classless society, but what happened? And even more intricate and numerous classes were created by Kim Il-sung's regime. And because uneducated people became the ruling class, society would operate very rough and cruelly without any intellectual questioning it. That is why North Korean society has become so violent.